So can I speak? Let's see. We have we have a few participants. We hope we'll get more. The time of the day is a bit special. Okay, but anyway. So as Tobias said, let's introduce ourselves. So we are the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, and we are very pleased to start this series of webinars that we have been developed and discussed with two partners, with APCOF and Fixed. I will give them the opportunity to say something about their organizations in a minute. So why did we think it was necessary to get together in a broad group that goes beyond the let's say the usual suspects? Many of us have been talking to each other, meeting each other in different contexts, but it's quite rare that we get together to try to talk about some very complex problems, but from the different entry points, different points of view that we have. So we have some colleagues who deal with crime prevention from the issue of policing, for example. We have some others that address these issues from the urban setting. There are some who have the public health entry point. And finally, what I have learned working in Geneva, there is an aspect of peace and security that sometimes people like me who have say, criminological background, they may not take into account while dealing exactly with the same phenomena, exactly with the same things that we may be discussing in different settings. So the need to have this broader discussion came up, and I'm very glad that we agreed to have that. So I will briefly give the floor to Sean Tate, if he is ready, to explain why he was so happy to join this group. Are you there, Sean?
Yes. Thank you very much, Anna. And welcome to fellow panelists and to participants. APCOF is the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum. It's an NGO focusing on mainly issues of police accountability and oversight, but working on a rule of law and reform agenda. Very much aware of the impact that our current climate in terms of C-19 has had on policing issues and the importance of the rights protections that we've built up over the past years for ensuring that we work towards a safer future. We have a lot of exposure in crime and violence prevention, where we've worked with many of the colleagues on this panel. And certainly we see that this intersection is even more important now. We know that police are not the resource that we need to return to when it comes to resolving complex public health issues like C-19, and that there are a number of partners in and outside of government who are essential towards building up the safety agenda. So we've developed this set of 5 workshops that will be running from now until next year as an opportunity to really talk through some of these difficult issues. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Anna, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Sean. Thank you for the introduction. The other co-organizer is also our first speaker for the day, so I'm happy to give the floor to Barbara Holtman.
As always, Hi, Anna. Thank you so much. It's really great to be together with you all today. When we were thinking about motivating for this series of workshops, we thought about what it is we wanted to do, and we decided that actually what we want to do is change the world, that we're a little tired of the kind of thinking that drives us, and we would really like to shake it up. And so Fixed is a consultancy in Johannesburg, and we like to offer alternatives to people who are looking to do things, and rather we like to guide them through processes that offer to help them look at what it is they want to achieve, or where it is they want to be, or what it looks like when it's fixed. So over the last couple of days, and Tobias, if you might load my slide, I just have one. Over the last couple of days, I've been privileged to moderate and therefore concentrate very hard on the inputs of an expert safety group in Madrid, although virtually, for UN Habitat Safer Cities. And it's been a really amazing time. And what I've tried to do on this slide is to frame our conversations by gathering the inputs that people made during that expert meeting group when they were talking about safety. So one of the key things that came across was that we all use different words as well as different concepts. And for me, one of the most troubling parts of the way that we talk about urban safety is that, and crime prevention and violence prevention, is that we always talk about it in terms of reducing the amount of violence or the amount of crime in a particular space. And as long as we do that, first of all, the best we can achieve is less crime or violence. So that's our objective, our stated objective in violence reduction or crime reduction or crime prevention. But secondly, so it puts a cap on what we can achieve. But secondly, it doesn't help us understand what the things are that we need more of. We focus almost entirely in our measurements on what we need less of. So if you look at the key on the right, you'll see that the measures that are used most, and this slide captures the mentions of three things in that 3-day meeting. And that was the measures that we use, for instance, homicide rates or gender-based violence or gun violence, going all the way through the spectrum to social upliftment, creative expression, optimism, and vibrancy. Theoretical underpinnings of those different measures, and those would be law enforcement, security, criminal justice, crime and violence reduction, psychosocial intervention, all the way through to participatory arts, which we call PACs, in another project that I'm working on that's looking for indicators for participatory art programs. And then we look at the data sources that we use, and those range from big data and crime statistics through to community engagement tools, qualitative research, and investment. And they're in the kind of moving towards the measuring both and, being what we want less of and what we want more of. There are things like victim surveys and safety audits. And I think some really interesting tools that crowdsource and engage people's lived experience. The reality is that one of the speakers yesterday talked about how we measure what we treasure. And it struck me that if we look at the spread of what it is that we measure, then it seems we treasure less of homicide, much more than we treasure more of collaboration, inclusion, trust, optimism, creative expression. Because if you look at the blocks below the lines, you'll see that those are the mentions of actual tools to capture information. So I think this one way to change the world is to rebalance this picture, is to find a way to ensure that we focus as much on the things that we want more of as on the things we want less of, and to put more effort into being able to measure the things we want more of, as opposed to just measuring things we want less of. And to find a balance in the both and, what we want less of and what we want more of, in that central space, through mechanisms such as observatories, evaluation practices, good practice depositories, use of social media, the use of neighborhood thermometers, for instance, and periodic reports where we compare ourselves against ourselves and not against other cities or other towns or other neighborhoods. So my question to start this session off is, what would the impact be on homicide, gender-based violence, gun violence, and property theft if we were to measure and therefore invest in, at the same level as we measure in dealing with those things, if we were to measure in issues of access to social services, social upliftment, creative expression, and vibrant neighborhoods? What would happen to the crime statistics if we invested more in those things? Certainly what we know is that as long as we measure and invest mostly in the things that we want less of, we're not going to see a great improvement in the things we want more of, because we're not valuing them and we're not treasuring them. So I think if I were to say why I want to change the world, it would be to say, in the words of a colleague, Professor Doris Sommer from Harvard, it would be to say that people have a dynamism. Humans, there is a human dynamism. People will do things. We can either try and control what they do to have less negative activity, or we can encourage them to do more of what we want to see. They're going to do something, and it's up to us about how we actually frame their activities. So that's my challenge for us in this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Yes, actually, we know that many of us have been spending their lives working for the reduction of bad things rather than the increase of good things. So the concept sometimes really need to be reversed somehow. I think it is a very interesting approach, this, and it's for me it's the first time that I see it graphically represented this way. So I think it's a very intriguing presentation. With this, I think that it will be interesting to hear what Juma Siago from UN Habitat says, and I don't know if Juma is ready. I saw him. Huh?
Yes,
he's online.
I am. Nice to see you, Anna.
Hello, Juma. Yes.
Yes. Much appreciated for inviting me to this particular session and to meet and to see many of you that I'm already familiar with. I'm glad also to see that the takeoff point becomes the just concluded expert group meeting, which Barbara has very well elaborately captured, which really speaks to the way we are, the evolution of safer cities over the past 25 years. One which embraces crime prevention, violence prevention, but has evolved into a much broader concept of urban safety. And in that urban safety, we are looking at how crime prevention, violence prevention has been integrated into broader urban strategies and interventions. As well, we are looking at the way in which prevention also has resonated with institutions. Many of us speak to the city, but do not really speak to how the city functions. And that perhaps has been one of the greater challenges that prevention has faced at the local level, in understanding just the way the city functions, and to ensure that in that way, in the planning perspective of the city, the management perspective of the city, and the governance perspective of the city, prevention becomes a go-to approach. We also have spoken lots about the prevention being anchored around the causes, the causation theories. Yet, in very many ways, the development sectors that really speak to those areas are not very well integrated when it comes to the implementation of those solutions. I may dare say that in many ways then, crime and violence prevention have appeared, while they remain multi-sectorial concepts, appear then to become, at the city level, a sector on their own space, completely detached and fragmented from those other line sections of the city that really are addressing whether it's education, sports, arts and culture, health, social services. They tend to see their policy frameworks running in parallel with prevention policies. And so, where are we today? Just last year, member states acknowledged for the first time the very principles we have been advocating for the last 2 to 3 decades on prevention at the city level. We now have what we call UN system-wide guidelines on safer cities and human settlements, which really brings to the fore ministries other than ministries of security and justice to lead this intervention by way of national urban policies, and integrating then prevention in national urban policies, and at the city level, ensuring that the city development and growth strategies embrace safety as a transversal policy of the city. And so we are speaking a lot to the institutional dynamics of the city, and how then we can measure improved safety and security based on the knowledge we have gathered in the fields of crime and violence prevention to bear on the city as a whole. The second point is the approach to the city. We are moving away from the angle that city is the bad outcome of development in the face of crime and violence, to one that is embracing the city as a source of development, which means we're moving less to the risk dimension of the city and more into how it has coped and adapted to the situations of crime and violence. And so engaging and investing in the social capital of communities is a key aspect of it. Looking at safety as a public good is a key aspect of it. And this goes, in my concluding points, this goes to also demonstrate that the more of what Barbara has spoken to, how we look into social cohesion, planning for social integration, as ways in which we need to embrace more and more in the way we measure prevention from the perspective of crime and violence. The way we see partnerships, we need to institutionalize them more within a local governance of safety framework. The way we look at policing today, we need to reimagine public safety with the dimension of how funding also is actually percolating or decentralized more and more from security to safety. We need to also see from a perspective of knowledge that we already have cities as the laboratories of knowledge. And we now need to approach cities as that laboratory that can actually facilitate learning between neighborhoods, learning between cities, to draw the innovations and come up with integrated solutions. And then finally, networking will require us to see to it that within countries, we establish action frameworks where civil society organizations actually lead those in collaboration with local governments and national government.
Well, No, excellent. No, thank you, Juma. Actually, thank you also for reminding us of the areas that will be actually the focus of the next webinars. Basically, these topics that you mentioned are those that will be unpacked in the series of webinars that will follow. Some of the issues mentioned by Juma are really at the basis of the work that has been done over the past couple of decades for safer cities. And I think that if we are here, that we can take for granted some of these principles. It's thanks to the work of a group of very dedicated experts, and of course Juma is one of them. And the ICPC that Ariane de Palacio is now directing is another key actor in this area. And I'm really glad that Ariane is here with us, despite the very early hour in the morning. Thank you, Ariane.
Thank you, Anna. Well, I have a baby at home, so sleeping past 6 in the morning is kind of a memory for me. So I'm up and running anyways. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I would like to maybe continue on what my colleagues have provided from a field perspective. And it's something that I was not sure I was not sure what I would be talking about today, and I chose to maybe share with you some considerations from the field that we've been having in the last 6 months of COVID, things that we've been facing through our work with the Montreal Urban Safety Lab, and how we are at ground zero right now. We are kind of in a blur in terms of what we know, how we can redefine our practices, our tools, the way we address and approach urban safety and crime and violence prevention in the light of what's happening and what's been happening for 6 months. So very humbly, I'm going to try to share with you some of the challenges that we've been facing and some of the maybe the avenues for reflection that we've identified so far. So maybe we can start with the first slide, please. I don't know how to. Thank you. So maybe what we've identified the pandemic has done, and again, I'm just speaking from a Montreal perspective and what we've been seeing so far. And again, it's a first world country, but we've seen some very, very real impact of COVID on the very core of what urban safety and crime and violence prevention address. So what the pandemic does, it feeds on urban inequalities. I think this is something that we've all seen around. It has especially been very virulent in high-density neighborhoods, has had a great impact on apartment building and those spaces where people are very densely occupying. Also, it has fed on the lack of access to safe outdoors leisure spaces in large parks, dependence on public transit and lack of walkability. So all of these urbanistic factors for marginalization that we've all known before. It also fed on essential work, especially here in Canada. Frontline caregivers in nursing homes and hospitals, waste management people, frontline retail positions, daycare services, etc., who are, that are jobs that are, provided by the same communities that are at risk and present higher marginalization factors. And its gravity and deadliness is correlated with social, racial, and economic marginalization factors, elderly people in care facilities, communities of color, people working jobs that cannot be performed from home, blue collars, etc., and immigrants with more difficult access to health services, homeless people, and people with housing insecurity, and in the Canadian case, Indigenous people, with the addition of this intergenerational trauma towards epidemics that really has fed this insecurity of Indigenous communities here. So what our collective responses have done in terms of, impacting urban unsafety, and they have weakened the informal social fabric. Isolation has been a very big problem, continues to be within families, communities, and neighborhoods, and has increased greatly the risk factors for violence and security. Our collective responses have also reinforced prejudices and led to an increase in discrimination and hate crimes in Canada. Especially the Asian community is very important and has been the victim of increased xenophobic attacks and hate crimes and discrimination. So this is something that we are following really closely. And they've made place for alternative realities, conspiracy theories, and distrust in social and political institutions, which in turn have increased the conflictivity and violence. And this is especially true here in Quebec, where this fringe that was already kind of leaning towards conspiracy theories have really radicalized and taken it to a more violent and proactive step. So this is extremely preoccupying. We've seen demonstration of violence and some aggression and assault towards journalists and politicians and public servants, which is very preoccupying. And what institutional responses have done, as we've seen, around the world, they have drastically limited access to basic services and dramatically increased the risk factors for crime and violence. We've seen that in many occurrences, especially for everything that relates to domestic violence and child abuse. They have weakened social control by weakening also this social fabric that is at the base of social control in crime and violence prevention. And they led to repressive approaches and an increase in racial and social bias and systemic racism and violence. We've seen that, for example, with the compliance of bylaws and public health measures that have, increased disproportionately affected people, communities of color and young people of color that might not have the means to fully comply with these types of measures. For example, people gathering outside because these are, families with a lot of people living in the same dwelling. So to get a little bit of privacy, the youngsters go outside to speak with their friends, and the police has been accused to really target these people. So increasing again the risk of crime and violence through racial bias and systemic racism. Next slide, please. So what we've seen is in terms of the evolution of key metrics, and again, we still don't know. We're in the blur right now. We have very little data. We can only gather what we've heard from our partners in police forces and on the ground. But in public spaces, we've had like a very important issue with gun violence, which in Canadian cities has been epidemic for a couple of years, especially in Toronto and Montreal. And we've seen all the metrics of street violence and street crime decrease, especially robberies, break-ins, assault. But we've seen violence remain steady, or in the Montreal case, increase, with a kind of a mutation in Montreal where gang-related gun violence has moved toward random shootings with the goal of intimidating communities and populations. So this is a very preoccupying turn, and we still need to grasp how it's related to COVID. Violence related to safety measure compliance is also on the rise, and this disproportionately affects those who are not law enforcement but have to be the compliance officers for safety measures. So it's public transit drivers. It is those people working in supermarkets and stores that are not equipped to face those type and to manage those type of violence, and that are at higher risk of violence, sometimes extremely violent reactions. We've had people being physically assaulted, run over with cars, etc. At home, of course, domestic violence and child abuse have been a preoccupation from day one. We've seen that correlated with economic stress, increased unemployment, deteriorated mental health, confinement measures, and alcohol availability. Here in Quebec, alcohol outlets were considered essential, so they were open throughout the pandemics. And again, suicides and self-inflicted violence are of the right too. And online, because we've seen an increase of violence and crime online, first with the displacement of some of the street criminality to the online space with an increase of cyber fraud, and also online violence and harassment. And as I mentioned, radicalization and violent extremism, especially with everything related to conspiracy theory and right-wing radicalization, has really, has like had these have fed on the COVID and the conspiracy theory to the point that it became a very preoccupying aspect. So that is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, thank you, Ariane. These are, there is someone who has, I hear an echo. Okay, now it's gone. So this is really, it resonates. I'm currently in Turin, in Italy, and a couple of days ago there have been riots and looting. And everybody agrees that this is a consequence of the lockdown of a few months ago that has increased the distance, increased the inequality, increased gaps between periphery and center, between the possibility to access, for example, I don't know, the distance learning, the fact that many schools had to go remotely and many don't have access to internet and computers. So I think that your reflections are very helpful, and it's good that you put them in this systematic way. We can keep them for reference. Thank you very much. Now we go to a completely different part of the world with Sunita Dar. Sunita, are you there? And it's it's late in the afternoon for you. Hello, Sunita. Tobias,
hello.
can you help?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Sunita.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Barbara. Essentially, what I thought I would draw out, and I've also looked at Barbara's amazing slide, is to really look at our work and relook at it in the context of COVID and the challenges ahead. Jagori is a feminist collective, and we have worked on building safer cities for women and girls for more than a decade, working with governments, community groups, NGOs, researchers, the works. And we did one of the largest studies. In fact, we pioneered the safe city approach in our country, as well as in the South Asia region. And we built a strategic framework based on the evidence that was gathered to convince the government of Delhi, and then later on also with other governments, to take forward a multi-sector approach to addressing these issues, which included both in terms of urban planning, designing, maintenance, public transport, policing, legislation, justice, and support to survivors, education and public awareness, and access to essential services, and the use of information technology. This was done almost a decade ago. The idea was to create an inclusive city, a caring city, a fair city, because we know that in our country and our region, gender and rights are a huge issue. There are huge gaps in equalities and access to services. Now, what did we learn from some of this? And one of our evaluation studies had told us that the hardware and the software of the city need to go together. And so it's not just what the infrastructure is about. India is building 100 smart cities today, but often I think they forget who are the inhabitants of that city. They forget the citizens, particularly those that come from the most marginalized sections, the last woman, the last man, trans, LGBTQI, vulnerable person. And so therefore, equal access to all is a dream. In the current COVID pandemic, we clearly saw the deep fault lines in society and the structural nature of inequalities and the devastating toll that it has taken on the most marginalized people and communities in terms of loss of lives, livelihoods, lack of food security, healthcare, social protection, and so on. We also saw that there was an absence of access to essential services and how the unpaid domestic and care work of women. One second, I'm just trying to look at how the absence of any supportive services for women affected their access to services of violence, to care, to additional support for household chores, and increase the incidence of violence at home and in the public space. We also saw very clearly that if we do not visualize the urban with the rural, then we're missing something. There's a continuum there. We saw scores of migrants, both men and women, rushing back to their villages and their districts because of lack of any survival mechanism in the city post the lockdown period. And therefore, it brought to us the fact that we need to look at women's work. How do we define work? In India, there's a declining workforce participation of women. And in the period of the lockdown and post the lockdowns, we're seeing the decline even further on small studies that have been done, particularly for women from the Dalit and other marginalized sections. We're also seeing the increase in the gender-based division of labor with a lot of workload on women and girls. Men have helped, but marginally. New studies are showing a huge difference in the time that women and girls have for rest and other activities. So the care economy is largely built on the backs of women. And we're also seeing the fact that the impacts on the informal sector workers, the domestic workers, trans people, and other sex workers has been extremely huge. So these are issues that have come to stay with us. The second point that has come to us, as I said, is the care economy and the fact that we need to integrally build the care economy with work. We need to value the care economy. We need to centrally address. We need to build the support services and provisions for women so that they can have a more productive life in our cities. The third point that I wanted to raise was the fact that an intersectional lens. When we started our work, as feminists, we deployed an intersectional lens, and it got deepened over a period of time with our practice, because we see women's rights are intersectional and that violation of one right erodes other rights as well. They're not linear. However, that's not the way the state and other agencies look at women's rights. And therefore, when we see in the context of COVID, not only is it a health issue, it had its impact on the economy, on social relations, on governance, and on even neighborly relationships, and the impact on the healthcare workers in the front line, the stigmatization of certain communities brought home the fact that we were dealing with a lot of prejudice and discrimination. We also realized that you cannot look at services in isolation, only focusing on prevention to build safer communities, safer families, building awareness in women and girls alone doesn't go very far until there's a linkage with services. And unless and until the system can deal with impunity. In India, we're dealing with socio-cultural norms, with patriarchy, and we are finding that these norms have created huge barriers for women and girls' participation in the everyday life of the city making and within their homes and in the governance systems. So the question that came to us is that we cannot deal with protectionist paternalism. We would like women and girls to realize their rights, their dreams, their choices, their freedoms. And that has been integral to our core of working on safe cities for women and girls. The other point that we learned about is the right to the city. We always talked about who owns the city, who shapes the city, whose voices count. And it brought home, the COVID pandemic brought home the point that most women, girls, men, transgenders, those from marginalized communities, informal sector workers felt that they suddenly unbelonged to the city. There was no space for them. There was no life left for them. The advisories, the stimulus packages forgot all about them. They forgot that they were legitimate citizens of the city. They did not even have the identity cards by which they could access some of the entitlements that the state was giving. So the question comes again to us that we have to redefine the right to the city and who the city belongs to. And there's a lot of work to be done for those that are invisible and those whose citizenship rights are not recognized, even though our constitution recognizes the rights of all to all the services, opportunities, and programs of the government. The other point that came to us was that we have to understand that violence against women is not a normalized issue. It's not part of a culture and traditions of a family, that it is a violation of women's human rights. And it is embedded in structures that are unequal. There are power relationships, there are social hierarchies that operate to discriminate against women and girls, and we have to address it centrally. We found that there was a lot more focus on domestic violence during the COVID pandemic than has ever been before, even though the data in our country shows that 90% cases that are reported in the police are that of domestic violence. The reporting on sexual harassment in public spaces and workspaces has still to pick up. There is far less reporting. And we also saw that there was a lot of violence in the quarantine centers, in the public spaces. And our National Commission gathered data that some of the violence was also by the police because they were not allowing access to essential services. So ultimately, I think what we need to do is to shift our paradigm and our think of another politics, another ethics, another set of collective action and solidarities. We realized that women's movement groups were alienated from the public space. A lot of things happened online, but as the lockdown reduced, a lot of women activists began to claim their voice and their rights in the public space. Of course, they had to take permission. So to claim the public for the governance, for their voices, for their inclusion in public policies, which was sadly missing, and to create a bottom-up approach was something that had come up during this period. And so therefore, I think it's important for us to say that women were excluded from the public policy making at this period of time. They were not included in any of the advisories. The advisories were gender and rights neutral. Some of them later then brought out additional, after all the noise that women's groups made, there were additional advisories on services for women. And I think that we need to reimagine a new future, essentially. And I want to recall the lines of Arundhati Roy, which has inspired many of us, which is to say that if you look at the virus as a portal and a gateway between one world and the next, we can choose to walk with it with our past prejudices, hatred, discrimination, bad ideas, but we can also go through it with a new imagination and build another world. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Sunita. Thank you, very inspiring. And so let's change the world. Indeed, this was the idea for all this. Let's try to change the world. Keith Krause from Geneva. I think that you had the privilege of listening to all the previous speakers, and so I'm sure that your contribution will be important to add a piece to this this puzzle piece in terms of peace, actually. So, Keith, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. A piece of the peace puzzle would be perhaps a good way to describe this. I'm going to give you, in 5 short minutes, basically an alternate perspective, the view from Geneva in some respects, in order to highlight what some areas of convergence might be with the urban safety agenda, and maybe some areas of complementary activity. A couple of things by way of background. In the Geneva context, the focus has been, and I'm using this very broadly, on such things as the instruments of violence through the lens of essentially arms control and disarmament measures brought down to the level of the city. And so there's been some work done on such things as controlling small arms in Libyan cities as the conflict erupted and collapsed there. There's a conflict lens that is applied by many actors, which involves not just focus on what we would think of as unconventional and urban-based large-scale violence. Some would call it warfare. Some focus on organized criminal violence that reaches a threshold that looks like warfare, and all of the entailments that go with that. And then the third, which is probably the most the piece of the peace puzzle, is a focus on peace building, principally through the lens of something called the Geneva Peacebuilding platform, which really brings together a whole set of agencies and actors in Geneva and beyond. And a small advertising plug, we have a Geneva Peace Week, which is starting next week, which is an online this year event that will have several dozen panels and several hundred participants, and it's in its 7th iteration. And so it's really an attempt to bring together some of these different communities that come at it from the international and some very traditional perspectives to this. So where is there some convergence? Well, if I could start with the issue of peace building, just generally, there's a clear recognition that peace building programming and peace building activities take place principally, although not exclusively, in an urban context. So, for example, with respect to post-conflict disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of ex-combatants, these programs have largely been conducted within or on the margins of cities, attempt to integrate people into their economic life of the city, etc. So there is no way to do or talk meaningfully about peace building practices without focusing on the urban context. Another dimension of this has been a shift in focus and greater attention to what we could call the local initiatives and the local perspective on peace building, and that moved away from state level and national programming and initiatives down to either community-based or in some cases sub-communities based initiatives and different sectors of society. And these two almost entirely occur in what we could loosely call an urban setting in many contexts. So there has been a growing recognition, and there's been some dialogues. There's an edited volume by a colleague of mine next door on urban safety and peace building, on how we might think about what, from our point of view, let's call it loosely Geneva, would be called sustaining peace in the city. And I hear very much, I echo Barbara's arguments from the very outset that much of the attention has been focused on the bad things that we want to reduce, but the whole discourse around peace building is also to try and draw out, in some respects, what might be the longer term goal here. And this is reflected also in SDG 16 on peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. And I recognize another debate that we should probably have about why we measure the negative things and the reductions and not the positive things. Parenthetically, in international peace research, there's also an attempt to do that and not to speak simply about reducing conflicts or the incidence of war, but measuring the quality of peace within and between communities, especially given that there are many other conflicts that occur at the subnational level. So I think there has been a bit of a convergence in this Geneva ecosystem, whether it's people who focus on the instruments of violence, whether it's those who focus on conflict and really hard-edged issues such as urban warfare and urban violence, and on peace building, towards a focus on the urban context of this. And that's an optimistic point. I should say that building the bridge between these two communities is still a bit of a challenge because there's some very, very different languages and ways of thinking. Now, the complementarity, which I think is also something that I can bring, speaking on behalf of a very large community, to the table, that could be summarized as follows: that much of the urban focus has been essentially on design, on the material aspects and dimensions of cities, whether it's the built environment, safer cities through better transportation networks, through street lighting, through issues of access and accessibility that come literally from the built environment. Whereas in the peace building world, the focus has been on concrete programs that deal with and address specific actors, and whether it's formerly violent actors or gangs, organized armed groups, or whether it's individuals who may be vulnerable to insecurity and to try and build resilience. And I think there's a very interesting nexus between the two, or at least a complementarity, because of course human beings act within the built environment. And there's been very little attention on the peace building side to these questions literally of designing for peace building. And here I think we have lots to learn from the urban safety community, which has a fair bit to say about the impact of design on people's well-being, on social and economic integration, and so forth. Then insofar as peace building has to take place in cities, we need to start looking at the very material and concrete, sometimes really concrete aspects of that. And I think that that's something that would be important to bring together. I think that a dimension of that I would like to underline also is that the peace building community has focused to some degree on addressing so-called root causes of conflicts, and that of course is also actor-centric in the sense of reducing inequality or improving access, but really reducing the incentives that individuals and groups have to resort to violence or reducing their vulnerability to violence and insecurity. And that is complementary to a focus on design, which of course doesn't necessarily, in fact, probably doesn't always address root causes. We can design road safety initiatives that don't deal with drunk driving, rather protect them against harms by putting in place airbags and seat belts and rumble strips so that people who fall asleep know that they're going off the road. And I think there's a definite complementarity here that should be explored between those kinds of initiatives that address in the long term some underlying root causes through things like intergroup reconciliation initiatives, and the very built space in which this has to happen, because of course how people move and interact in cities is a big part of this. So there are some, I think there's some, as a kickoff to reflection for the for this webinar series, I think there's some really interesting points of convergence and complementarity, and I would encourage the urban safety community to think about learning from us. There are two things that I would mention as omissions at the end here that I would like to put on the table, and one of them is what we could call the sort of political economy of the city. And of course, there's a lot of reference to issues associated with inequality and marginalization. And Ariane mentioned, of course, how employment patterns and status affect vulnerabilities and risks, not just to COVID, but to other forms of violence. There are two things about the political economy of the city we need to think hard about. And one of them is the impact of globalization. Cities are not insulated either from their countrysides or from these broader moves in political economy. And I think that that in the current context puts some very, very severe limitations on what can be done, if we will, both because of fiscal pressures on the state, but also the nature of globalization that has really hollowed out the opportunities for inclusion, or actually it exacerbated exclusion in many of the world's major and minor cities. And the second is the illicit economies that, of course, flow through and within and are often concentrated in cities. These are sort of 2 points of reflection that I think we should draw upon. And then the last is that from the Geneva perspective, there's also been a lot of attention both in peace building and in other institutional forms dealing with conflict and development around institutions. And of course, that brings us back to the traditional agenda of security sector reform and the role of institutions such as the police and other. It's been mentioned by a couple of speakers, but there are many people in this city, in Geneva, that work on these issues that I think should be brought partly into this dialogue as well. I think that's all for me for kickoff, and I found the preceding presentations very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, thank you, Keith. I think this is exactly what we wanted to hear, this type of thinking across communities about these very complex issues, and referring to the city as the hub, as the place where things happen for good and bad. You mentioned that peace building is happening in cities. So and Juma also confirmed that we have moved beyond the original concept of seeing the city as the place where a lot of crime was happening. So actually now cities are opportunities, are places where also the solutions can be found. So thank you to all the speakers. I think that we had an excellent group of speakers who put together quite a very interesting puzzle now. And we will now go back to the panel in reverse order, because Keith, being the last speaker, had the privilege of the first questions. So in the chat, there is already a question that is for you, Keith. That is, I find the link between crime prevention and peace building really interesting and inspiring. Are there ways that the urban safety community can strengthen this link and share learning and practices that can strengthen both sectors? You have already partially addressed that, because you have said that they should learn from you. But anyway, this is a very specific question. And then I would also add to something. There is another question that is from Angelica Hoffman from Servas International NGO Committee on Status of Women in Vienna. The NGO Committee on Status of Women is another organization that joins NGOs dealing with women issues, and she is asking what can her organization or private person do to move forward on this discussion. And so this is a question that is for all speakers. And another question that I would like to add myself is really, where do you think that we should really place emphasis in moving forward? So what do you think can be done that we haven't already been thinking of? Shall we do more research? Shall we do a platform? Shall we do what? Create another community? Suggestion that would lead us to a next step. So I will now give the floor for a shorter intervention to each speaker, and please, everybody, ask your questions in the chat or raise your hand, make yourself visible by Tobias, who can monitor raise the hands and things like that. Thank you very much. So, Keith.
Okay, these are hard questions, and I'll take them in a different order. In terms of what organizations and private persons can do, I think one lesson that I learned from Manuel Eisner, Cambridge criminologist, who's started to shift the work on cities, is that cities are about the right size of organization for people to come together, whether it's in a formal setting such as an observatory on urban safety or sustaining peace in the city, or just informal forms of activity. Because at the national level, it's too cumbersome, too difficult to identify who the key players are, too difficult to mobilize resources, and easy to lose energy. So the first thing is, look around you in your particular city context, or catalyze these kinds of things in other cities. And I know that in Geneva, for example, there has been a recently created Geneva Cities Hub, which is a sort of urban actors that's also trying to catalyze at the global level the work that they can do locally. So that's the first thing. I find cities enormously creative places to think through these questions around violence prevention and reduction, which leads me to the second, the big question from Emma, which is how can the urban safety community strengthen this link and share practices? I mean, I hinted at that without being too explicit, because I'm not an urban safety expert. But some of the more inspiring presentations I've heard were people who spoke on issues of urban design that emerged from the mobilization of communities to enhance their own safety, whether it was calling for better streetlights in their community, or some kind of slightly more permanent and community-based police presence, or the ability to even interact with the security institutions that are often seen as a greater source of threat. So very much trying to focus on how design of your environment and the one in which people interact in can have a fairly significant impact, not just on reducing the negative harms that Barbara talked about, but in enhancing the positive dimensions. There is an uphill battle here, because one of the big trends in urban safety, not in this community, but in the real world, has been essentially garrisons, whether it's gated communities or isolation or physical barriers that are being put in place, and sometimes non-physical but very real barriers. So focusing on again, some of these elements of the built community, because on the peace building side and violence prevention and reduction, programming has not paid attention to any of those things by and large. Paid attention to the actors dealing with people who perpetrate violence or who are vulnerable to it, or dealing with harm reduction strategies with that. So I think that's where I would try and find common points, again, in a specific context, in a particular city or a range of cities. And of course, all cities are very different in that regard. So that's also partly answered Anna's question. What do I think we should do? I think finding some let's not call them best practices, but good practices. And I use the term observatory, but I mean that very loosely. Where is it that people have come together, breaking out of their silos, and drawing together some experiences? Peacebuilding has been operating in a very large but still quite siloed way, and has its own communities of practice, etc. But they almost never reflect on how they could bring in some other actors on a small and local scale. So trying to inventory where this has happened as a starting point would be, I think, a good thing. And then the rest is up to people working in their local communities, which many of you do. I didn't call for more research. That would be cheap and easy. But, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we there are two things that we have not been talking about, and one is the Sustainable Development Goals, that are sort of hanging in the air, but I think everybody has referred to issues that are fundamental and part of the SDGs, but nobody is talking about the SDGs. And the other thing is that even the best laid plans collapse when there is a stress like the COVID-19. So, and maybe we can put also the SDGs into these best laid plans. So, one thing that maybe also the next speakers can take into account in their response is something like that. So what else should be done for planning for the unplanned, coming from the conflict sector, from the peace building sector? This is already part of the story in a way, because the conflict per se is not something that you're planning for, but it happens and disrupts certain balances. But for most of us who have been living in relatively peaceful settings, a pandemic is very similar to the disruption of a conflict. So I don't know if this can also be taken into consideration. I will just give you just very briefly the opportunity to respond to what I said, because I forgot to say this before. Kit.
Unmute myself. I mean, I'm not going to confess ignorance on this, but I will say that I'm very curious to get some of the experiences from other people in this regard. And I think my task, and seen from the perspective of Geneva, is to try and open the conversation up in Geneva a little bit further. So that's, yeah, I'm going to think about that. Let's put it that way.
Okay. And with that in mind, thank you very much. With that in mind, we have another question in the chat, and this is, I think, mostly a question for Barbara, who mentioned we measure what we want to treasure. Are there already indicators for how to measure what we want to treasure? And I would like to give the floor to Sunita to react to this discussion. Sunita.
Thank you. My first response is to the issue of peace building. I think it's imperative that we learn to build peace within our homes and deal with the conflicting interests and entitlements and abuse in the home, and also build peace within our communities. In the context in which we live, which society is getting deeply polarized, politics of division are being played around the world and in some parts of our countries and regions. And I think it's important to make the link, peace from the home to the city, to the globe, etc. And I think there's a missing link somewhere in our peace building strategies, because we never want to address the most difficult domain, and that's of the family and the home. Because it's time for men and those that hold patriarchal, masculinist, militaristic power to step back a bit and to rethink about how to recreate another society with humanism, with care, with fairness, with justice, and especially gender justice. So that's one point that I would like to make in making the link to the peace building efforts. At the level of what an organization can do, I think there are many ways to reach out to communities, to the governments, through campaigns, work with young people, do safety audits. There are low-hanging fruits in terms of, as Keith has already mentioned, of looking at where the gaps in the infrastructure are, whether it's street lighting, whether it's walkway paths, whether it's access to common public services, and getting the governments to respond to that. We've had some good successes in that with our community teams. And also for young people to look at how would they change the use of public space and the right to public parks, the right to safe spaces, whether in the schools, once schools restart, colleges start, the market space, etc. So there's a lot that can be done, both in terms of creative campaigns, in terms of using the arts, and in terms of also engaging the government and local agencies in such things. We have also established safety centers in communities run by the local community, in which young people who want services, counseling, mental health, knowledge, information can be linked via the safety centers to the redress systems. In terms of what we can also look at is also rethink our urban design. Our urban design never includes the needs and the lived realities of women and girls, doesn't factor in access of those with disabilities, pregnant women. The way our public toilets are designed, they're actually not designed for women, they're designed for children, because we infantilize women in urban design. We think women and children are the same. And so therefore what works for children works for women. So we have forgotten to see women as autonomous beings with their own needs and rights. We also need to re-look at how budgets are spent. And right now, it's very difficult to get data as to where the money is being spent and how it is being spent. But we have done studies on called gender responsive budgeting of what is the investment into safe cities, where do these resources go, are they adequately spent, how are they designed, are some more privileged than the others. Such data can be very, very useful for redesigning public services and outreach to those that are on the margins. We also need to learn, we feel it's very important in most countries for migrant people, for those that are homeless, for those that are working on the streets, to have what is called, you can look at designing a multi-purpose center for women. So if there's a creche there are public services of water and sanitation, there's a vending zone, there are redress mechanisms close by, access to public transport, that it's easier for women to plan their day and to be able to be both within their reproductive, their community work and their productive work. For services of violence and gender-based violence, as you are working on that, it's important to build an ecosystem of response and to make sure that implementation takes place. And also to collect data. I think it's very important, the point that you have asked, Anna, I think research is very much needed. I think there's a lot of new data that's come across the world. I'm not sure how it is being used to redesign our policies and our implementation plans and our budgeting and transformative financing plans. I think there's need to do that. I'm certainly for platforms and alliances, because I think we need to build global solidarity, national solidarity, regional solidarity. And I would also like to say, my last point, we need a second generation of tools, because we are now between an online and an offline world, and we need to build new observatories, new set of tools, and new ways of reaching the community. Thank you.
Great points, Sunita. Great points. Really, I was writing down, because I still use pencil and paper, and this is so true that we need a second generation of tools. Keith also mentioned the observatories, and we working in this area. We have all. I remember there was someone who mentioned one particular observatory. Oh, so it is that house, no? So the image, the collective image of the observatory is a physical place, but now it shouldn't be like that. Now it's different. There should be the possibility to connect differently, and this is still really underused and underexploited. So thank you, excellent suggestions. And I think you also had in the chat, you had praise for your comment that peace starts in the home. And there were 2 participants who were very much in agreement with you. Thank you very, very much. So we go back on the list, and the next is Ariane. Ariane, are you ready to respond to these questions, even if they were not directly addressed to you?
Yes, absolutely. Maybe I would try to make 3 points. And the first one is about our need, and this need has been really made crucial by the COVID crisis, and it's to reinforce and rebuild community resilience, social fabric at community level, and civil society and community-based organization networks at community. Basically is to reinforce the focus on the hyperlocal, and not stopping the decentralization process that has empowered cities to really embrace the urban safety and crime and violence challenges, but also to bring it really to the hyperlocal and community level. And this calls for 3 maybe avenues for reflection, and the first one is, how do we re-empower and rebuild post-COVID these networks of community-based organizations, but also networks that are more or less formal or informal at community level, and that have been damaged to a point that we're just starting to grasp by the COVID in terms of funding cuts, in terms of losing these outreach capability, losing contact with communities, losing contact with public institutions that have been occupied with dealing with the crisis, and all of these resources have been diverted. So we need to rebuild all these, very fragile fabric that we're just understanding how fragile, how sensitive it is to all these crises and these challenges. The second point is to call for indicators that measure this hyperlocal, qualitative, positive aspect of crime, violence prevention, and urban safety. And it just also speaks to what Barbara has been talking about in her slide. How do we measure that? And it's something that at ICPC, working with observatories and urban safety labs, we've been really trying to wrap our heads around, and is how do we bring this whole tools of measurements to the hyperlocal, to the qualitative, to the particular, to the specific, trying to desystematize it and also integrate what we know how to deal with traditional data, but also integrate that with that more qualitative, information, instead of having those as 2 lines of work. You have your quantitative, serious kind of the real information, and then you have that more soft, maybe less reliable because less systematized. How do we value that information that comes from the hyperlocal and from, also personal perspectives, from personal stories, the hyper, local, the personal, perspective. So this is very, very important. And the third point, and it's related to the first 2 ones, and it's participation. We tend to look at participation as something that is as long as you put in place those means of participation, it's something that should be self, evidence should go without a problem. And in public safety and urban safety policies, we tend to take participation as an ingredient of the policy rather than an outcome. Participation must be an outcome. Participation is something that is built and that is worked on, and a good participation is the result of a long process of mobilization, engagement, trust building. So how do we create mechanisms of participation that ensure a proper participation, that ensure that the quality of the participation that we want to reach and attain, and that ensures full participation from those we want to reach, marginalized communities, high-risk communities, marginalized groups. How do we reach out to these people and have their participation as an outcome of those public safety policies rather than a given? In most of the times, we see participation means and mechanisms being less successful than we would want them to be because they are not seen as those processes that have to be refined, worked on, and that are an outcome and an objective by themselves. So these would be my 3 points, and I would also like to really also stress the necessity to have these different types of objectives when we look at urban safety and crime and violence prevention, and not underestimating the importance of quick wins. A lot of things have been said, especially by Sunita, around street lightings and those urban design elements. Those can be quick wins. Those can be the little things that are so important for people's perspective, for communities' access to the city, that might be a bit overlooked when we talk big strategy and citywide strategy and big outcomes. We need to make room and make more room for those quick wins, because they are also the base on which trust is going to be built within the community and towards public institutions.
Thank you, Ariane. No, this is a very important thing. When we work on city policies and strategies, we always say that one of the obstacles is the short term of projects and programs and the long term of objectives, and so to try to find a way between the two. And also this observation about the participation as an outcome rather than an ingredient. I think it's an important reflection that is valid also for the political will, the support that sometimes is built on trust, and it's not really something that one should take for granted, also to make sure that it is sustainable over time. So thank you for these important inputs that we are going to collect for our follow-up. And I would like to give the floor to Juma. Is Juma there?
Yes, I am here.
Please, Juma.
Okay, so in my observation, I agree with what most of the speakers have actually said, and I wouldn't want to repeat or belabor the point. The only aspect which I will definitely emphasize on is the city. And as I mentioned earlier, understanding the concept of the city as an element of social integration. In this sense, it gives us the possibilities to really address the society in its entire units, in terms of the individual, the family, the school, the home. But understanding this in a systemic way. Essentially, we have the possibilities of making localities safer if only we are better able to leverage on the institutions that are. There was one of the theorists that actually put across an argument that being in the 21st century, which is largely considered as an urban century, the city in itself is now considered as a unit of analysis, a unit of societal analysis. And if we look at it this way, we will then be able to understand the human being more than just being a Homo sapien in the way we've always understood him or her, to one that is a Homo urbanus, which makes us understand that the subculture can no longer be criminalized as we do by legislation that speaks to a traditional concept of society. Today, we understand the family beyond just the nuclear family. Many young people today in cities, particularly in those spaces that we otherwise consider as hotspots, are young people who are growing in family structures that are beyond just the nuclear family, traditional nuclear family. They belong to family settings that are single-headed families, that are peer group families, but so often get criminalized by virtue of their identity. And so the understanding of city today comes with a new narrative, with a new set of terminologies that need to come to bear on crime prevention and on peace building. To understand the city as a heterogeneous entity, to understand that its differentiatedness is actually its strength. And when we look at that, we zero down to the neighborhood as an anchor to the types of principles and approaches we put in place. And we begin to understand public space and urban safety in terms of design as a space for community appropriation. And when we see that the strength of cities in providing communities and citizens with tools or with assets or with resources that can actually enhance trust building that we often speak about, that can enhance the way citizens interact with each other, that we understand in the way the citizens can participate in the co-production of safety and security for all, then we need to really be clear about those identities such as neighborhood. Neighborhood means different to different people, even within a city. The way you understand neighborhood is not the way I understand neighborhood based on our socializations. And if we look at it in this way, then we will be able to recreate prevention in a way that local governments can actually latch on indicators that can actually begin to help them invest in ways that measurable impacts begin to be understood or seen. And so this is really where my emphasis would be, that addressing the urban change is a key fundamental aspect, what we should now integrate into our crime prevention and peace building lingua. This would be my strong emphasis. Again, when we think of safety as a common good and public space there as the space that allows us not only in its availability, but in its use and in its access, it provides us the way to also look at that as a measurable framework to see how we are actually building the culture of prevention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juma. Thank you. You got support from Keith about the Homo urbanus, and I think it's a great point. And also your suggestion about identifying this common language, this synergy between the concepts of crime prevention and peace building. It's a very important aspect. And also talking about institutions, I'm sure that in your work, Juma, you mostly deal with the Sustainable Development Goal 11, no? And that
yes.
is one on urban settings. And for us, it's mostly the goal 16. That is about peaceful and inclusive societies and strong institutions. So the point of institutions is a very important one that I think recurs in these conversations as a strength and as a weakness for cities somehow. So perhaps in a future discussion we may bear in mind a bit how to deal with the institutional approach. What do you think about that?
Awesome. I really appreciate it. In fact, again, goal 17, which is about global partnerships, really bring to bear then how we build the synergies between this SDG 16 and SDG 11, because it will be the partnerships that will actually implement this and implement the kind of lingua that we really want, integrating this targets and indicators that come out from both SDG.
Excellent. No, thank you very much. So we bring back the SDGs a bit, because the SDGs is true, they are very ambitious, but I really love them, although they count on a system of global indicators that are a bit, too much on the hard data, side. But they can be supplemented, they must be supplemented by a lot of other information, a lot of other indicators that can also be qualitative, they can also be soft indicators, they can be national indicators or city. There is quite a lot that can be done and should be done to support the work on the SDGs. And you also got, Sunita also confirmed that you made a great point on the right to build diverse families and not to be criminalized. Thank you very much for this. So I'll give the floor to Barbara now. Back to your initial concept, and what do you think of this discussion and the questions that you have heard about?
So I think it's been really fascinating conversation, and I think there's so much to build on here. I really love the link that Keith has made between urban safety and peace building, and I think that what links us is a vision of where we want to go. We all want to live in a place that works for everyone. Sunita's, I think I was quite moved by Sunita's input, as I always am, about looking particularly at the issues in the face of the pandemic, the way that the burden of care falls with women, and yet so little of the benefits of the city are actually accessible to women. And the reminder that world peace starts at home, which I think is a really important point. This is not something that is beyond us. So I think Juma hasn't muted himself. I think it's not, thanks Juma, I think that it's not, it's really important for us to look at it from that very personal perspective, that safety is not just something that somebody does out there or does differently somewhere out there. I've been working with Sean on a little piece of work, supporting some work that he's doing on xenophobia. And it just keeps coming back to me that this is about the personal choices we make every day. And peace in the home, peace in the neighborhood, peace in the city, peace in the world is about personal choices. And when we look at what's happening in the world today, it's just inconceivable that we have come so far from the vision of what it looks like when it's fixed. If we look at what's happening in the States this week, if we look at the terrible responses that people have to have, in South Africa, it's been called the smoke that calls, where people feel that unless they burn things, unless they are angry, unless, as you say, happened in Turin, Anna, there is violence associated with their responses, people won't listen. And here we are, 8 months into a pandemic that has no definite end to it. We don't know when it will end. We don't know when things will shift again, where we can begin to trust human contact the way that we've been socialized to believe in it and to want it and to promote it. And here we are angry with each other in so many instances. And I think that anger, as it plays out across the world, the reflection of our inability to be more nuanced in our responses, to accept that with anger comes sadness and grief, and a huge need for expression, with very few tools to actually express those things other than in a violent and destructive way. I've been very struck by the work, and I saw there was a question about indicators that can be used in terms of, for instance, what we've called PAX, which is which we've called it capital P, capital A, small x, because it's participative arts and then everything else, essentially, which is about creativity or about festivals, about coming together, about building social cohesion, about demystifying each other. And we've looked at 5 indicators that contribute to urban safety. And I think I would be really interested to hear from Keith if these don't overlap very well with the issues of peace building. So the first is good governance, where we need we need cities and local municipalities to be good partners, to understand the value of different kinds of interventions, and to allocate policy and capacity, build capacity, and formalize partnerships for good, in the spirit of good governance. And we look at inclusive, safe public spaces. And I think public places is a really interesting thing that we've talked a lot about, and we will continue to talk a lot about. And on the one hand, there is the view that what we need to do is to harden public spaces as in terms of a target, to make access more difficult, to increase technology and surveillance. But the other side of that coin is that natural surveillance, that use of at all hours of the day by all different sectors, will make places much safer. And I think we need to invest in that in terms of the right to the city, exercising the right to the city for diverse users and users. We look at social cohesion, we look at community participation and inclusion. And I think Ariane's point about what we mean by participation and how inclusion really plays out and who we need to include, that it's not just those who are easy to reach, but it is essential that we expand our idea of inclusion to include vulnerable groups of all kinds, and to not invite them to an existing table, but to ask them to help design the table that will make their participation easier. And then communication, advocacy, and innovation, where culturally vibrant spaces and neighborhoods must contribute to a safer city, much more so than, for instance, the more expensive options and exclusive and elitist options of gentrification. And then the issues of prosperity and resilience, and creating a culturally diverse economic development with civic empowerment interventions that look at issues like local marketplaces, local abilities for people to trade, to serve one another, and to address the very sad issues of isolation and mental unwellness that we are seeing. Everybody has been disrupted by COVID. This is not something that is only some of us. Everybody has become vulnerable in the face of COVID. And we cannot on our own, any one sector, make this make this different. We can't commit ourselves to a new future, to a new world, unless we are prepared to work together, and unless we're prepared to have the courage to compromise and to expand our thoughts by having conversations like this. And so I'm very grateful to be a part of this conversation. And I really look forward to the future ones. Thank you so much, Anna.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thanks a lot. I got a signal from Keith that he can briefly respond to the point that you raised. Keith, are you there? Yes, you are.
I am, and I apologize for also having to run because I'm defending a doctoral thesis or doing that in 10 minutes. But first of all, I thought Barbara's points were really interesting, and I think we ought to come up with ways to stress the positive sides of cities, which are, relative to their countryside in many places, sites of inclusion. They are sort of creative melting pots in various ways, and they're sites of experimentation. So, when we look at where xenophobic and other movements emerge, they're most often in disadvantaged areas and often not the urban centers in which they are located. This is certainly true in the United States and parts of East Central Europe and elsewhere. So there's I'm very much enamored with the Homo urbanus idea because, of course, as Juma pointed out, this is also sites where mixing and intermingling occurs. There were extraordinarily high levels of intermarriage in Sarajevo before the Balkan Wars, right? That was a site of creativity. Peace building also, to answer Barbara's question, by its definition, it has to focus on what it means to build a positive peace. So it gets us already partway to that. And many of the sort of measures that are undertaken, such as truth and reconciliation or transitional justice, these are programs designed at national levels, but they can be used at local levels and reframed in different kinds of ways as well. Truth and reconciliation isn't just about finding perpetrators of large-scale crimes in major conflict zones, but it can also be used as ways of healing communities, for example, if it's done properly. And so I think there's many kinds of threads that can be teased out and pulled forward to that. And finally, yes, the emphasis on I'm going to call it soft, but in a positive way, means of ensuring security and safety through existing kind of social fabric and social resilience. And we haven't spent much time using the term resilience. Is definitely going to have to be a counterweight to what we must acknowledge is a very harsh mano duro or other kind of discourse fighting crime and violence and marginalization that is clearly ascendant in many of our countries and cities. Although I would even say in the United States, cities are a site of resistance to that in many cases, and I expect that's also going to be true elsewhere. So I too will say thank you to this. I will miss the last couple minutes, but I will be interested in the follow-up from this. And everybody else.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Keith. By the way, we are recording this, and the recording will be placed somewhere on our website. So if you want to listen to the last pearls of wisdom that we will share in the final minutes. Thank you very much. We still have a few minutes, so I don't know if any of the other panelists want to add something or if any of the participants want to ask anything else. The floor is open. Please indicate that you want to speak either in the chat or somehow. Is there anyone? Tobias, can you help me if I don't see?
I don't see anyone waving or...
Linda.
No, Juma.
Juma and Linda. Okay, Juma.
Yes, I just wanted to really laud this initiative and say that in this institutional conversation around how we go forward to implement the thinking that is coming out of this fields of crime, violence prevention towards a new dispensation around urban safety, has a very important role for civil societies structured in partnership with governments. And I would really encourage this platform to seize the opportunity of establishing action frameworks at a national level, engaging cities as the anchors to the agenda, and in this way begin to influence the policies and programs that cities are undertaking in implementing urban safety programming. Again, to use those action frameworks to really bring to the fore measurement and monitoring in such a way that they become accountability frameworks. And that in this month of October, which we in Habitat define as the Urban October, and which also is the 40 Days Safer Cities Challenge, we can see more of those action frameworks releasing reports on an annual basis on the state of safety in cities. I think if we move in this direction with civil society taking their role already to anchor such frameworks and bring cities as the point of conversation, I believe we will be going many steps forward in institutionalizing partnerships.
Excellent. Good point. No, thank you very much, Juma. This is a very important thing to bear in mind also for the continuation. There was Linda McDonald wanted to say something.
Thank you. I wanted to say that the work that Jean Sarson and I do on non-state torture, people think that non-state torture or torture that happens in the home happens in isolated areas or in rural areas, excuse me, or by uneducated people, all the myths and biases that are out there. But I wanted to share that many of the thousands of women that have contacted us over these many years are tortured in cities, are tortured in very expensive homes by powerful people, politicians and other government leaders. And when Sunita said that we have to look at peace starting in the home, we have to look at all homes, and we have to remember these women and girls who are invisible and still don't have their rights with the SDGs. I put our fact sheet on non-state torture and SDGs in the chat. And we know that now research shows that the way women and girls are treated shows the security of the country. So that moves down to the way that women and girls are treated in cities and how safe and secure they are. So if more people are open to understanding that powerful people can indeed torture their own children, it will change the way we will understand the power imbalances in our cities, and it will change the security of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. That's an important point, of course. And I think it goes back to some of the speakers have raised the issue of families, and that who said that peace starts in the family. No? So another couple of minutes we have before I just give you a short wrap up. Anyone else who wants to add something? Panelists, participants? No, I don't know. Sean, if you are listening, would you like to say something as one of the organizers to comment?
Sunita
yes.
wants to say something.
Okay. Sunita, and then Sean, if he's available, I would like to hear also from him if he has any comments. Sunita.
I just wanted to add a point to, evaluation and monitoring indicators. I think while at a macro meta level, national level, there are all these indicators that are being designed as part of compliance with the SDG requirements. And many countries don't have compatible indicators, not collect sufficient data, and they're, playing around with the data sets. I think there's also a need to design community-based indicators, because if the communities can audit and seek accountability from their local government structures and agencies, it works very well. There is a relationship building there. There's an accountability which is not confrontational alone, but which is also constructive in nature, where women play an important role, young people play an important role, and the rest of the community participates. So working towards community-based monitoring systems at a local district block level, and I'm talking in the context of India, and it can be translated to whatever are the levels of governance in other countries, it's very important to invest into such systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Is Sean online?
Yes, thank you, Anna. I think this conversation really has confirmed the importance of this series of webinars. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thoroughly appreciated the inputs of the panel. I think some of the information was new and yeah, particularly useful for what we want to take forward. So I hope we see each other again when we convene the next meeting, and we give serious thought to what we want from the international community when it comes to reaffirming and responding to the current challenges that we're experiencing in the field of crime and violence prevention and safety promotion in general. I also appreciate the closing remarks by Juma that civil society has an incredibly important role to play in this process, and certainly we need to think through how we can become more active and not lose those gains that we've made over the years. Thank you very much for the facilitation, Anna. It was absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. If there is anyone else who wants to add something, this is the very last chance. Otherwise, I will just wrap up in a second. Okay.
I'll suggest could we get a recording of this?
Yes, definitely. Tobias is taking care of this. Tobias is the secretary of the Alliance, and he is now an expert in WebEx matters. So our plan is to transfer this to our YouTube channel, and we will make the link available to all participants and on our website. So this is hopefully going to be seen also as an introduction to the next webinars. I will just briefly tell you again what are the dates. We will start on the 12th of November with webinar 1 on partnerships, collaboration and integration to make urban safety possible. Webinar 2 will be in January, on the 20th of January, on police and policing in urban safety system. Webinar 3, 27th of January, on mental wellness and resilience as central to urban safety. Webinar 4 on 10th of February, knowledge systems to enable your urban safety. And webinar 5, so what? It is the actual taking everything home. Networking and lobbying for investment in global urban safety will take place on the 17th of February 2021, next year. We are doing all this because we hope to prepare a document, something that we can bring to the UN Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, that will take place in Kyoto from the 7th to the 12th of March. It has been postponed. It should have been in 2020. And obviously, it is going to be a different type of discussion than last year. It is important to bring to the table of the diplomatic discussion contributions that indicate what has changed in this year. And possibly that indicate also solutions and roles that can be played. Definitely, the role of civil society is fundamental, and this is why we are here. The Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice is really aware of this need to be more active, more proactive, more present, and to defend the space for civil society that is also a bit eroded in this type of pandemic. Sometimes we see that we have some difficulty in accessing the UN discussions that normally were accessible to us. We really have to fight to maintain our right to participate and to be heard in these processes. So type of discussion like this, multidisciplinary, multi-actor is really fundamental. Take away from this webinar as so many that I don't think I can summarize them in a proper way, but definitely I think that we heard confirmation that it is important to find a common language between different communities and different stakeholders to make sure that we take also innovative approaches to identify the stressors, to identify what may be placing an additional burden beyond what has already been identified in the past as difficulties of different communities to work together in advancing on urban safety, but additional threats that has been generated by the pandemic. This can also become an opportunity because there may be ways of operating that have started now, like I don't know, working remotely and studying from home that have represented also an element of inequality and disruption, but on which it may be possible to work together in the future to try to fill some gaps more effectively. So I think we have quite a lot of good suggestions for the next webinars, and I think we want to invite all the speakers to follow us and stay with us as much as they can for the next webinars. The list of speakers for the next one will be announced soon. And we hope that the participants enjoyed this discussion. We are really very grateful that you were with us today. Thank you for following this discussion. And I wish you a very nice afternoon for those who are in Europe, or rest of the day for all the others. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.